Richard Glossip. In 1997, a motel manager in Oklahoma City was arrested for a murder he insisted he did not commit. Over the next 27 years, he would eat 3 separate last meals, come within hours of death 9 different times, and outlast a United States Supreme Court decision that had once cleared the way for his execution. And in February of 2025, that same court would rule that the state of Oklahoma had violated the Constitution to send him to the death chamber in the first place. Richard Eugene Glossip was working as the manager of the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City, a job he had held for about a year without incident. He had no prior violent record, no history of trouble with police, and no obvious motive to want anyone dead. His employer was the motel's owner, a 54-year-old businessman named Barry Van Treese, who drove down from Lawton every week or so to check the books and collect the cash from his properties. On the morning of January 7, 1997, Barry Van Treese was found beaten to death in one of the rooms of the motel. The weapon was a baseball bat. The man who swung it was a 19-year-old maintenance worker named Justin Sneed, who lived at the motel in exchange for handling small repairs. Sneed was arrested within days, and he did not deny that he had committed the killing. But he told investigators that he had not done it alone. He said Richard Glossip had offered him roughly $10,000 to carry out the murder, and that the plan was to make it look like a robbery so that Glossip could take over the running of the motel and cover up money he was accused of stealing. There was no physical evidence connecting Glossip to the crime. No blood, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no confession. The entire case rested on the word of Justin Sneed, and Sneed had a strong incentive to say what prosecutors wanted him to say. In exchange for his testimony against Glossip, Sneed was allowed to plead to a lesser sentence. He avoided the death penalty and instead received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Glossip was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1998. In 2001, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals overturned that conviction, ruling that his trial attorney had been ineffective. The state tried him a second time in 2004. A new jury reached the same verdict, and a new judge imposed the same sentence. What followed was one of the longest and most closely watched death row cases in modern American history. How could a man be scheduled to die 9 separate times and still be alive to talk about it? The first execution date came and went, then the second and the third. In September of 2015, Glossip was moved to the execution chamber and served his final meal before Governor Mary Fallin issued a last-minute stay. Prison officials had discovered they were about to inject him with the wrong drug. That incident became part of a larger legal fight over Oklahoma's lethal injection protocol, and the resulting case, Glossip versus Gross, reached the Supreme Court, which in 2015 upheld the state's use of the sedative midazolam by a vote of 5-4. But the story of Richard Glossip did not end there. Over the following years, independent investigators, including a team commissioned by Republican members of the Oklahoma legislature, began to uncover serious problems with the original case. They found that prosecutors had allowed Justin Sneed to deny, falsely, that he had been under the care of a psychiatrist and taking lithium for bipolar disorder. They found that a box of trial evidence had been destroyed. They found that the state's key witness had been guided in ways the jury never heard about. Then the case took an unusual turn. Oklahoma's own Attorney General, Gentner Drummond, reviewed the file and concluded that prosecutorial misconduct had tainted the conviction. He asked the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals to throw the verdict out. The state court refused. Drummond then joined Glossip's defense team in asking the United States Supreme Court to intervene. On February 25th of 2025, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Glossip versus Oklahoma. By a vote of 5-3, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor writing the majority opinion and Justice Neil Gorsuch recused from the case, the court held that prosecutors had violated their constitutional duty to correct false testimony from Justin Sneed. The conviction was vacated, and the case was sent back for a new trial. In June of 2025, Attorney General Drummond announced that the state would retry Glossip for first-degree murder, but that it would not seek the death penalty this time. His reasoning was that the man who had actually killed Barry Van Treese was already serving life without parole. On May 14th of 2026, an Oklahoma County judge granted Glossip bond. He was fitted with an ankle monitor and released to await his third trial, still maintaining that he had nothing to do with the death of his employer. The Van Treese family has said publicly that they continue to believe in his guilt and have urged the court to move the matter to a swift resolution. As of 2026, Richard Glossip is alive and out on bond, awaiting a third trial with no death sentence on the table. Richard Glossip's case is one of a man who outran the death penalty for nearly 3 decades. The next case moves in the opposite direction. It belongs to a man who was sentenced to die, then spared by the highest court in the country, and then sentenced to die again for the same killing more than 20 years later. Michael Bascom Seltzer. On the evening of September 15, 1975, 2 men walked into a U-Tote-M convenience store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with the intent of robbing it. When they walked out again a few minutes later, the store's manager was dead on the floor, and a young cashier was bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. The take was a little over $500. The road that killing put into motion would run for the next 37 years, through 2 trials, a Supreme Court decision, a federal appeals court reversal, and finally, to an execution chamber in McAlester. The 2 men were Michael Bascom Seltzer and an accomplice named Richard Eugene Dodson. The store's manager was 55-year-old Clayton Chandler. The cashier, a 20-year-old woman named Ina Louise Morris, was working alongside him that night. According to the state's account, based on the autopsy, Seltzer shot Clayton Chandler 6 times. Some contemporary news reports put the figure at 8. Either way, the manager died where he stood. Dodson turned his weapon on Ina Louise Morris and shot her as well. She survived, though the injuries were serious, and her testimony would eventually help send both men to prison. Seltzer and Dodson fled Oklahoma. Within a week, they were 1,500 miles away in Santa Barbara, California, spotted by police officers because they were still driving the same car with Oklahoma license plates. They were arrested there and returned to Tulsa to stand trial. In 1976, Seltzer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death under Oklahoma's death penalty statute. At the time, that statute made the death sentence mandatory for certain categories of first-degree murder. Just months later, the United States Supreme Court decided a case out of North Carolina called Woodson versus North Carolina, which struck down mandatory death penalty laws as a violation of the 8th Amendment. Companion rulings from the court applied the same reasoning to Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals then modified Seltzer's sentence from death to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the next 20 years, Michael Seltzer was a lifer. He was moved through the state prison system, classified and reclassified like any other long-term inmate, and by the late 1980s, he was considered a trusted prisoner. He was known within the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester as a run guy, an inmate given a degree of freedom of movement inside the institution. He participated at times in prison tours for schoolchildren, but the case was not finished with him. In April of 1996, the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit reversed his murder conviction entirely, on grounds tied to the way the original trial had been conducted. What was the state supposed to do with a case that had been reopened more than 2 decades after the crime, with a defendant who had already served most of an adult life sentence? Prosecutors chose to retry him. In 1998, a new jury heard the case. It reached the same verdict the first jury had reached: guilty of first-degree murder. And this time, because the mandatory statute was long gone and jurors were free to weigh the aggravating and mitigating circumstances themselves, the jury imposed a death sentence of its own accord. Michael Bascom Seltzer was condemned to death a second time, more than 2 decades after his original death sentence had been set aside, for the same 1975 killing. His accomplice, Richard Dodson, followed a different path through the courts. At the retrial, Dodson was acquitted of Clayton Chandler's murder, but convicted of the armed robbery and of the shooting of Ina Louise Morris. He received 50 years for the robbery and 199 years for the shooting. Seltzer's post-conviction appeals ran for another 14 years. His attorneys challenged the constitutionality of resentencing him to death after decades of a life sentence. They argued that the passage of time had made a fair penalty phase impossible. They argued that his behavior in prison, including his role as a trusted inmate on death row, weighed against execution. Every argument failed. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied clemency by a vote of 4-1. On May 1st of 2012, Michael Bascom Seltzer was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was 57 years old. In his final statement, he apologized to the family of Clayton Chandler, asking, in effect, if it was too late to say he was sorry. Nearly 37 years had passed between the crime and the punishment, one of the longest such intervals in modern American death penalty history. As of 2026, Michael Bascom Seltzer's execution stands as one of the clearest examples of how a single Supreme Court ruling can extend a capital case in ways nobody predicted at the time. The events of April the 29th of 2014 would reshape the modern debate over the death penalty in the United States. They began inside a small execution chamber in McAlester, with a man on the gurney who was still visibly conscious after he was supposed to be dead. Clayton Darrell Lockett. What happened at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary that spring night in 2014 would prompt a statement from the President of the United States. It would cause the state to redesign its entire lethal injection protocol from the ground up. It would result in a 6-year moratorium on executions in Oklahoma. And it began with an intravenous line that had been placed in the wrong place, in the wrong way, on a man the state had spent 15 years preparing to kill. Clayton Darrell Lockett was born in November of 1975. By the time he was in his 20s, he had accumulated 4 separate felony convictions. On June 3rd of 1999, he and 2 accomplices went to a rural home outside the town of Perry, Oklahoma, with the intent to rob a man named Bobby Bornt. Bornt was beaten during the robbery. His infant child was in the house at the time and was not physically harmed. Then 2 visitors arrived at the house. A 19-year-old woman named Stephanie Naiman, who had graduated from high school just weeks earlier, and a female friend of hers. Stephanie Naiman refused to cooperate with the intruders. She refused to promise that she would not go to the police. Lockett walked her outside, where a shallow grave had been dug at his direction. He shot her with a shotgun. When the shotgun jammed after the first shot, he cleared the malfunction, chambered another round, and fired again. He then ordered his accomplices to bury her while she was still alive. Naiman's friend was raped by 2 of the men. Lockett was arrested, tried, and in the year 2000 convicted of first-degree murder along with rape, kidnapping, robbery, burglary, and assault. He was sentenced to death and to an additional 2,285 years in prison. He was transferred to Oklahoma's death row at the McAllister Penitentiary. 14 years passed. His appeals ran through the state and federal courts and were exhausted. An execution date was set for April 29th of 2014. That night, the state of Oklahoma used a new 3-drug protocol for the first time. The first drug in the sequence was midazolam, a sedative that the state maintained would render the condemned prisoner unconscious before the second and third drugs paralyzed his body and stopped his heart. The execution team inserted an intravenous line into Lockett's arm and began the injection. How could an execution carried out inside a modern American prison, with medically trained staff and a written protocol, go so wrong that it would trigger a national review? The answer, according to an independent autopsy conducted later, was that the intravenous access had failed. Officials would claim at first that a vein had blown. The autopsy told a different story. The execution team had failed to properly place the line and had at some point attempted to insert a femoral line into Lockett's groin. Whatever the exact combination of causes, the drugs did not do what they were supposed to do. Lockett began to move on the gurney. He lifted his head. He spoke. Witnesses reported hearing him say that something was wrong, that the drugs were not working. Prison officials lowered the blinds so that the witnesses could no longer see what was happening inside the chamber. Behind those blinds, staff attempted to halt the execution. It was too late. 43 minutes after the process began, Clayton Lockett was pronounced dead. The official cause was listed as a heart attack. President Barack Obama called the events at McAllister deeply troubling and asked the Attorney General of the United States to conduct a review of how the death penalty was being carried out across the country. Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, described what had happened as torture. The state of Oklahoma launched its own internal review. When that review was finished, it had overhauled the execution protocol from the ground up, adding a second intravenous line, mandatory checks to confirm the prisoner was unconscious before the paralytic was administered, new equipment, and new training for the staff. The following year, the Supreme Court took up the question of whether midazolam itself was constitutional as an execution drug. In Glossip versus Gross, the same case that would later become entangled with the Richard Glossip appeals, the court ruled 5-4 that Oklahoma could continue to use the sedative. But further problems with the state's supply of execution chemicals, including instances where the wrong drugs were delivered to the death chamber, led Oklahoma to pause executions altogether. That moratorium would last roughly 6 years, until 2021. As of 2026, the botched execution of Clayton Darrell Lockett is still cited in national debates over lethal injection, and Oklahoma's current execution protocol was written directly in response to what happened inside the McAllister death chamber that night. The fourth case on this list belongs to a man whose crimes were driven by the paranoia of a mind burning on drugs and by the code of the street gang he had spent his short adult life inside. Michael Dwayne Smith. On the evening of February 22nd of 2002, a 19-year-old man in Oklahoma City set out to punish 2 people he believed had crossed his gang. By the end of the night, both were dead. One had been shot at her own front door for being related to someone the gang thought was a police informant. The other had been shot 9 times, doused with lighter fluid, and set on fire because the gunman believed he had spoken to a newspaper. Neither, according to the investigation that followed, had done anything to the gang at all. Michael Dwayne Smith was born in June of 1982. By the time he was in his late teens, he was a member and eventually an enforcer of an Oklahoma City street gang known as the Oak Grove Posse. On the night of the killings, according to the evidence presented at trial, he was under the influence of the drug PCP. His first target that night was a woman named Janet Moore, in her early 40s. Smith did not go to her home looking for her. He went looking for her son, a man he wrongly believed had been talking to the police about the Oak Grove Posse. Janet Moore answered the door instead. Smith shot her at close range and left. Her son was not there, and according to investigators, he had never been the informant Smith imagined him to be. His second target that night was a convenience store clerk named Sharath Babu Paluru, who was in his early 20s and worked long shifts at the store. Smith believed, again wrongly, that Paluru had spoken to a local newspaper about the death of a fellow gang member. Smith entered the store, shot Paluru 9 times, and then poured lighter fluid over his body and set it on fire. The killings that night were not the only crimes Smith would answer for. He was separately convicted of second-degree murder for the November 2001 shooting of a 26-year-old man named Otis Payne, Jr. That case had gone unsolved for months before it was eventually tied back to him through the same investigation that produced the February 2002 arrests. Why did prosecutors ultimately believe that a 19-year-old with a violent gang record deserved not 1 but 2 death sentences? The answer lay in the specifics of the 2 killings from February. In October of 2003, an Oklahoma jury convicted Michael Dwayne Smith of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Janet Moore and 1 for Sharath Babu Paluru. For each of those convictions, the jury recommended a sentence of death. He was also convicted of the second-degree murder of Otis Payne, Jr., for which he received a life sentence, along with 85 additional years for robbery, burglary, and arson. Smith was transferred to death row at McAllister. His appeals ran for more than 2 decades. His attorneys focused in part on his mental state at the time of the killings, on his history of substance abuse, and on procedural claims arising out of the way certain evidence had been introduced at trial. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals rejected those arguments. The federal courts rejected them at successive levels of habeas review. His clemency application was denied by the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board by a vote of 4-1. His execution date was set for April 4th of 2024. He was transported to the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was strapped to the gurney. The intravenous lines were placed. Under the revised protocol that had been developed after the death of Clayton Lockett, the process was monitored more closely than it once had been. Michael Dwayne Smith was pronounced dead in the execution chamber that morning. He had spent roughly 21 years on Oklahoma's death row. The families of Janet Moore, Sharath Babu Paluru, and Otis Payne, Jr. were represented in the state on the day of the execution. Prosecutors said publicly that the sentence closed a case that had haunted 3 separate families for more than 2 decades. As of 2026, Michael Dwayne Smith's execution stands as one of the more recent examples of Oklahoma's return to routine capital punishment after the long moratorium that followed the death of Clayton Lockett. The 5th name on this list involves a case in which the violence was tied to an ideology that had, by the year of the killing, captured headlines around the world. Alton Alexander Nolan. In September of 2014, a factory worker in a small town outside Oklahoma City was suspended from his job after a co-worker complained that he had made racially charged remarks. He left the plant, drove home, retrieved a large knife, and returned. Within minutes, he had taken the life of a 54-year-old woman using that knife, and had begun attacking a second woman inside the same building. He was stopped by an armed civilian who was at that moment both the chief operating officer of the company and a former reserve deputy. Alton Alexander Nolan was born in August of 1984. He had a lengthy prior criminal record and had spent time in Oklahoma prisons on other charges. Around the year 2013, he had converted to Islam and had taken the name Jakim Yisrael. He was employed at Vaughn Foods, a food processing plant in the town of Moore, Oklahoma. In the weeks leading up to the attack, according to statements from co-workers gathered by investigators, he had begun to press others at the plant about his religious beliefs, and his social media accounts had begun to fill with images consistent with the extremist propaganda that was, at the time, dominating international news coverage of the terrorist group known as the Islamic State. On September 25th of 2014, Nolan was called into a meeting at Vaughn Foods and informed that he was being suspended following the complaint about racial remarks he had made toward a coworker. He left the plant. He drove to his home. He returned a short time later with a knife. The first person he encountered upon his return was Colleen Hufford, who was 54 years old and had worked at the plant for years. Nolan attacked her with the knife and took her life, in what news outlets would later describe as a beheading. He then turned on a 43-year-old woman named Tracy Johnson and began attacking her. Tracy Johnson survived, in part because of what happened next. Mark Vaughn, the chief operating officer of the company and a former reserve deputy in Oklahoma County, retrieved a rifle from his vehicle. He confronted Nolan inside the plant. He shot and wounded him, ending the attack. Tracy Johnson was rushed to a hospital and survived her injuries. Federal and state investigators immediately began looking into the possibility that the attack was an act of ideologically motivated terrorism. Nolan's social media, which contained images of beheadings and references to Islamic State propaganda, played a central role in the way the case was described publicly. Federal prosecutors initially considered terrorism-related charges. The final case was pursued in Oklahoma State Court as a first-degree murder prosecution. What does a court do when the defendant himself is trying to help the state secure the sentence it wants? That was the question that shaped the legal phase of Alton Nolan's case. From an early stage, Nolan made clear that he wanted to plead guilty and that he wanted to be executed. He told the court repeatedly that he did not wish to contest the charges. The trial judge refused to accept those pleas without first satisfying the court that Nolan was mentally competent to make them. Court-appointed experts examined him. He was found competent to stand trial and, in a separate proceeding, found not to be intellectually disabled in a way that would bar his execution under Supreme Court precedent. In September of 2017, Alton Nolan was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Colleen Hufford, along with additional counts related to the attack on Tracy Johnson. On December 15th of 2017, he was formally sentenced to death. His appeals moved through the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals over the following years. In March of 2021, that court upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. His case then entered federal habeas review, where his attorneys raised issues related to his mental health, the influence of extremist material on his state of mind, and the trial court's handling of his repeated attempts to plead guilty. As of the middle of 2025, those federal proceedings were still pending. No execution date had been set. The family of Colleen Hufford has spoken publicly, on more than one occasion, about the length of the process. Tracy Johnson, the woman who survived the attack, has spoken as well about the changes that Day made to the rest of her life. Vaughn Foods, the plant where the attack took place, continued to operate after the case moved out of the daily news cycle, and the events of that morning in September of 2014 remain among the most cited examples in Oklahoma of a workplace attack tied to extremist ideology. As of 2026, Alton Alexander Nolan remains alive on the death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, more than 11 years after the killing at Vaughn Foods, with no execution date currently on the calendar. If you're finding this video worth your time and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment to do it. It genuinely helps the channel keep putting these together. The sixth case on this list is the one that comes closest to the promise of the title. It belongs to a man who was never sent to death row for his crime, but who spent the next 4 decades trying and sometimes succeeding to break out of the prison that housed him. Garland Rex Brinley, Jr. In February of 1971, a young kindergarten teacher walked outside her home in Bristow, Oklahoma, and turned the key in her husband's pickup truck. She died instantly. A bomb had been wired to the ignition, and it detonated the moment the engine turned over. Her husband was scheduled to testify against a local plumber and nightclub owner in a criminal matter just days later. That plumber would be convicted for the killing and sentenced to life. But the story would not end when the cell door closed behind him. Over the next 13 years, he would escape the Oklahoma State Penitentiary twice, once during the most destructive prison riot in American history. The plumber was Garland Rex Brinley, Jr., based out of Tahlequah, Oklahoma. He was well known in eastern Oklahoma for his business and for the nightclub he operated on the side. He was also, according to prosecutors, deeply involved in criminal activity that had brought him into direct conflict with a man named Don Boulding. Boulding had been cooperating with law enforcement and was scheduled to appear as a witness against Brinley in the days following the bombing. The bomb was not intended for Don Boulding's wife. It was intended for Don Boulding himself. But on the morning of February 2, 1971, his 28-year-old wife, Dorotha Fern Boulding, went to start the family truck first. She was killed at the scene. The Boulding's young child was inside the home at the time and was not physically harmed. The investigation moved quickly. Federal and state authorities focused almost immediately on Garland Brinley. The physical evidence, the motive, and the timing all pointed in one direction. Brinley was charged with first-degree murder in state court. He was also charged federally with conspiracy involving explosive devices and firearms, a set of charges tied to the broader criminal operation he was accused of running. He was convicted. In a departure from what would become common in Oklahoma capital cases in later years, prosecutors did not secure a death sentence. Brinley received a term of life in prison. He was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester to serve it. Life at McAlester in the early 1970s was, by every credible account of the era, extraordinarily dangerous. The prison had been designed to hold about 1,100 inmates. By 1973, its population had grown to more than 2,200, roughly twice its intended capacity. Gang divisions inside the walls ran along racial lines. Violence between prisoners was routine. The staff was outnumbered. What was a man serving a life sentence in a prison that was about to explode planning to do with his time? The answer, in Garland Brinley's case, was to leave. On July 27th of 1973, a riot broke out at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary that would eventually be described by prison historians as the most destructive in American history in terms of property damage. Rioters took 22 hostages. Fires burned across the compound. 24 buildings were destroyed, with total damages later estimated at around $22 million. 3 inmates were killed by other inmates during the uprising. Another died of natural causes, Order was not fully restored until the following week. Somewhere in the chaos, Garland Brindley walked out. He was one of a number of inmates who used the riot as cover to escape from the institution. He was recaptured, returned to McAllister, and continued to serve his life sentence. But he was not finished. In June of 1976, he escaped again. This time, the method involved a utility tunnel underneath the prison. He was one of 7 convicts who broke out through that route in a single coordinated attempt. He was recaptured a second time and returned to the same cell block. 8 years later, in 1984, guards conducting a routine search of his cell discovered a weapon and ammunition that had been hidden inside. Investigators concluded that the items were part of a planned third breakout attempt. Brindley was charged internally for the contraband and given additional restrictions. He would not escape again. Throughout the decades that followed, Brindley continued to insist that he had not planted the bomb that killed Dortha Fern Boulding. He maintained his innocence in every parole review, every media interview, and every appeal his attorneys pursued on his behalf. None of those appeals succeeded. He remained a life-sentenced inmate at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary through the end of his time in the prison system. On December 18th of 2009, Garland Rex Brindley Jr. died at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary of natural causes. He was 76 years old. He had spent nearly 38 years in custody for a killing he never admitted to. Don Boulding, the man the bomb had been intended to kill, outlived him. The Boulding's young child, who had been in the house on the morning of the bombing, went on to build a life outside the reach of that day. As of 2026, Garland Brindley's case remains the clearest example on this list of an inmate whose criminal record inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary rivaled the one that put him there in the first place. The 7th case on this list is one of only 2 in which the killing itself took place inside an Oklahoma prison. It would end, decades later, in an execution that witnesses would describe in ways the state itself refused to accept. John Marion Grant. In November of 1998, a 58-year-old cafeteria worker at a state prison in Hominy, Oklahoma, was dragged into a mop closet by an inmate and stabbed roughly 16 times with a homemade blade. She died at the scene. The inmate was already serving 130 years for armed robbery. He would spend the next 23 years on Oklahoma's death row, and his execution would eventually become one of the most closely watched in a decade, in part because of what several witnesses said they saw when the drugs began to flow. John Marion Grant was born in April of 1961 in Ada, Oklahoma. His adult record was long by the time he reached his mid-30s. He had been convicted of a series of armed robberies and had been sentenced to a combined term of 130 years in the Oklahoma prison system. He was housed at the Dick Connor Correctional Center in Hominy, a medium-security state prison north of Tulsa. Working in the prison cafeteria at Dick Connor was a woman named Gay Lee Carter. She was 58 years old. She had been employed at the facility for years and was known to the inmates who ate their meals in the dining hall. On the afternoon of November 13th of 1998, Grant approached her, dragged her into a mop closet inside the food service area, and stabbed her repeatedly with a shank he had manufactured himself. He struck her roughly 16 times. She died at the scene. Grant was already serving a long sentence. There was little the state could add in terms of custodial time. Prosecutors instead chose to seek the death penalty, arguing that the killing of a civilian employee inside a state facility, carried out by an inmate already serving a lengthy term, was precisely the sort of crime the capital statute was designed to punish. A jury agreed. Grant was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was transferred from Dick Connor to the death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. His appeals ran through the state courts and then the federal courts over the following 2 decades. His attorneys raised questions about his mental health, about the way the trial had been conducted, and about the constitutionality of Oklahoma's execution protocol as it evolved through the years after the botched execution of Clayton Lockett. None of those arguments succeeded in permanently blocking the sentence. What made Grant's execution date, when it finally arrived, one of the most consequential in a decade? The answer had to do with timing. His execution was scheduled for October 28th of 2021. That date fell at the end of a roughly 6-year moratorium on executions in Oklahoma, a pause that had begun in the wake of the Lockett execution and the drug procurement problems that followed it. Grant's execution would be the first the state had carried out in 6 years. The eyes of the national press, of anti-death penalty advocates, and of state officials who wanted to demonstrate that Oklahoma's revised protocol was working, were all on the McAllister death chamber that afternoon. According to journalists who witnessed the execution, what happened inside the chamber did not resemble what the state had promised. After the sedative midazolam was administered as the first drug in the 3-drug sequence, Grant reportedly began to vomit. Witnesses said he convulsed roughly 24 times before he was declared unconscious. He was pronounced dead at 4:21 in the afternoon. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections issued a statement following the execution, describing it as having been carried out without complication. That framing was directly contradicted by the accounts of the reporters who had been present in the witness room. The gap between the two versions of events triggered a fresh round of legal and political debate over whether Oklahoma's revised execution protocol had, in fact, solved the problems it had been designed to solve, or whether it had simply produced a new version of the same problem. Attorneys for other men on Oklahoma's death row filed emergency motions in the days that followed, citing the accounts of the Grant execution as evidence that midazolam continued to be an unreliable component of the state's lethal injection sequence. Those motions moved through the courts over the following months. The state ultimately maintained that the execution had gone as planned. As of 2026, the execution of John Marion Grant remains one of the most contested in modern Oklahoma history because of the sharp disagreement between the state's account of the execution and the account offered by the journalists who witnessed it. The 8th case on this list involves a defendant whose sentence of death has now been imposed on 3 separate occasions, overturned twice, and left standing today as he sits on the Oklahoma State Penitentiary's death row, waiting for a date the state has not yet been able to set. Alfred Brian Mitchell. On the afternoon of January 7, 1991, a 21-year-old University of Oklahoma student was working her volunteer shift at a community center in Oklahoma City when she was attacked and killed. Her attacker was an 18-year-old man who had been released from juvenile detention only days earlier on his 18th birthday after serving time for a violent crime he had committed as a young offender. He would be convicted of the killing. He would be sentenced to death. And over the following 3 decades, that sentence would be imposed 3 separate times, thrown out twice, and left standing today as he waits on death row for an execution date that has yet to be set. The victim was Elaine Marie Scott. She was 21 years old. She was a student at the University of Oklahoma, and she was volunteering her time at the Pilot Recreation Center on the day of the attack. She was attacked with a wooden coat tree and sexually assaulted. She died at the scene. Her attacker was Alfred Brian Mitchell. He was 18 years old at the time of the killing. Days earlier, he had been released from a juvenile facility, having served a term for an offense committed as a young person against another young person. That prior offense is distinct from the capital case. It matters here only because it explains why an 18-year-old with a documented history of violence was walking free in Oklahoma City in the first week of January of 1991, Mitchell was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder along with additional counts arising from the attack. He was convicted. In a separate penalty phase, a jury heard evidence about his background, his prior record, and the nature of the killing, and returned a recommendation of death. The judge imposed that sentence. That should have been the end of the trial court phase. It was not. What happens when the prosecution's own conduct becomes the reason a case cannot stay closed? That question defined the next 3 decades of the Alfred Bryan Mitchell case. His conviction and sentence entered the appeals system, where his attorneys raised concerns about the way prosecutors had handled certain evidence during the trial. Specifically, they raised concerns about evidence that they argued should have been disclosed to the defense under the constitutional rule established by the United States Supreme Court in Brady v. Maryland, which requires prosecutors to turn over material information favorable to the accused. They also raised broader concerns about prosecutorial misconduct during the penalty phase. The appellate courts agreed, at least in part. Mitchell's death sentence was overturned on appeal. He was resentenced. His sentence was overturned again. He was resentenced a second time. And each time, the state chose to seek and secure a new death sentence, arguing that the underlying facts of the case, and in particular the nature of the killing of Elaine Marie Scott, warranted no other outcome. In total, Alfred Bryan Mitchell has been sentenced to death 3 separate times for the same crime. His case has now moved through nearly every stage of the appeals process that Oklahoma law provides. As of the mid-2020s, he has essentially no remaining appellate avenues at the state level. What has kept him alive, at least in the short term, is not a legal argument, but a scheduling decision. In 2024, an execution date was set for October 3rd. That date was then vacated, not on the basis of a new appellate ruling in his favor, but at the request of the Oklahoma Attorney General's office, which had asked the state's courts to increase the spacing between scheduled executions. The office cited the strain that a compressed execution schedule was placing on the prison staff who carry out those sentences. Mitchell's date was one of the ones that was moved. Since then, no new date has been set. He remains at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He has now spent more than 3 decades on death row, longer than most of the men whose cases were profiled earlier in this list. The family of Elaine Marie Scott has spoken publicly on more than one occasion about the length of the process, and about the fact that a case which appeared on paper to be complete in the year of the killing has now stretched across the entire adult lives of the people most affected by it. As of 2026, Alfred Bryan Mitchell is alive on Oklahoma's death row. More than 32 years after the killing of Elaine Marie Scott, with 3 imposed death sentences, 2 of them overturned, and no execution date currently on the calendar. The 9th case on this list belongs to the first man Oklahoma executed after the United States Supreme Court cleared the way for the modern death penalty in the middle of the 1970s. Charles Troy Coleman. In February of 1979, an elderly couple in rural Muskogee County, Oklahoma, walked in on a burglary at their own home. Both were shot execution style. 2 months later, awaiting trial for that killing, the man responsible cut a corrections officer's throat, stole his revolver, escaped from the local jail, then carjacked and killed a second person before he was recaptured in Arizona. 11 years later, that same man became the first person executed by the state of Oklahoma after the reinstatement of capital punishment, and the first person ever put to death in Oklahoma by lethal injection. Charles Troy Coleman was born in March of 1947 in Muskogee, Oklahoma. His criminal record began in his teenage years and grew steadily longer through his 20s and into his early 30s. By the winter of 1979, he was 31 years old and had accumulated a long history with the local courts. On February 9th of that year, Coleman broke into a rural home in Muskogee County, belonging to a couple in their 60s. The husband, John Seward, was 68 years old. His wife, Roxy Seward, was 62. The couple had not been expected home. They walked in on the burglary in progress. Both were shot at close range in a manner prosecutors would later describe to the jury as execution style. Coleman was ultimately charged with the murder of John Seward. He fled the scene. He was arrested and jailed in the Muskogee County facility to await trial. In April of 1979, he escaped. The method was direct. He slashed the throat of a corrections officer who survived the attack, took the officer's service revolver, and walked out of the jail. He then carjacked another individual, a man named Russell E. Lewis, and shot him fatally during the encounter. He fled the state. He was recaptured in Tucson, Arizona. He was returned to Oklahoma to stand trial. How does a system that has just been rebuilt after being effectively dismantled by the Supreme Court decide who becomes the first man to actually die under its new rules? The answer, in Oklahoma's case, was Charles Troy Coleman. He was convicted in October of 1979 of the first-degree murder of John Seward. The jury heard about the killing at the Seward home. It heard about the jail escape and the killing of Russell Lewis. It returned a recommendation of death. The judge imposed that sentence. Coleman's appeals ran for the next 11 years. They moved through the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, through the federal district and appellate courts, and eventually to the United States Supreme Court. They did not succeed. During those years, the modern death penalty in the United States, which had been reinstated by the Supreme Court in 1976 after a 4-year effective moratorium, was still finding its footing. Oklahoma had a statute on the books. It had a death row. It had condemned prisoners. It had not, however, actually carried out an execution under the new regime. That changed on September 10th of 1990. On that date, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Charles Troy Coleman was executed by lethal injection. He was the first person put to death by the state of Oklahoma after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. He was also the first person ever executed in Oklahoma by lethal injection, a method the state had adopted as its primary means of carrying out capital sentences. In his final statement, Coleman told the witnesses that he wanted his family and friends to know he loved them and that he had peace and a quiet heart. He was pronounced dead a short time later. The Coleman execution was covered heavily by state and national media. It represented the end of a 14-year absence of state executions in Oklahoma, and it opened the door to the more than 100 executions the state has carried out in the years since. The families of the Sewards and of Russell Lewis, some of whom had been waiting more than a decade for the sentence to be carried out, spoke publicly about the outcome. Some expressed a sense of closure. Others said that the length of the process had made closure impossible in any meaningful sense. As of 2026, the execution of Charles Troy Coleman remains a marker in Oklahoma legal history, the case that reopened the state's death chamber after a 14-year pause. The final case on this list is one of the most recent, and one of the few in which the manhunt for the man responsible would run longer and cross more state lines than the trial that eventually put him on the Oklahoma State Penitentiary's death row. Scott James Eisember. In October of 2003, an elderly couple returned home to their rural property in Depew, Oklahoma, and discovered a man inside their house who had broken in and been lying in wait. Neither of them left the house alive. The man responsible then crossed the street to a home where his ex-girlfriend was living with her mother, attacked both of them and shot her teenage son, and then fled. What followed was one of the longest manhunts in Oklahoma history, a 37-day search that would cross roughly 500 miles in 3 states and would end in Texas with the fugitive shot and wounded by one of the very people he had taken hostage. Scott James Eisenberg's early life had been difficult. His mother had died by suicide when he was an infant. He grew up in an environment marked by addiction. As an adult, he developed a pattern of domestic violence, including a prior allegation that he had held his girlfriend, a woman named Kathy Biggs, hostage and assaulted her in Tulsa. After that incident, Biggs had obtained a protective order against him and had moved out of Tulsa to live with her mother in the small community of Depew, Oklahoma, hoping to put distance between herself and Eisenberg. Eisenberg followed her. His plan was to lie in wait at a home across the street from where Biggs was now living. That home belonged to 76-year-old A.J. Cantrell and his 70-year-old wife, Patsy Cantrell. On the morning of October 18th of 2003, Eisenberg broke into the Cantrell home, intending to watch through the windows for signs of Biggs across the street. The Cantrells were not supposed to be home. They came back unexpectedly. Eisenberg shot Patsy Cantrell. He then took the same shotgun and used it to beat A.J. Cantrell to death. He then left the house, crossed the street, entered the home where Kathy Biggs was staying, shot her teenage son, and beat her mother. The son and the mother both survived. Eisenberg fled the scene in a stolen vehicle. The manhunt that followed ran for 37 days. How does a fugitive stay hidden across 3 states, 500 miles, and more than a month of intensive law enforcement pressure? Eisenberg's answer, at least at the beginning, was to disappear into the wooded terrain around Depew and the neighboring town of Bristow. Search teams, tracking dogs, helicopters, and volunteers combed the area for days without result. When the pressure eventually pushed him out of Oklahoma, he moved east into Arkansas. There, he forced his way into a home occupied by a physician and the physician's wife, and held both of them at gunpoint for an extended period. He eventually left with the couple in their own vehicle. The physician and his wife were driven into Texas. What Eisenberg did not know was that the physician's wife was a concealed carry permit holder. At some point during the ordeal in Texas, she was able to retrieve her firearm. She shot Eisenberg, wounding him. Law enforcement was alerted, and Eisenberg was captured shortly thereafter. His 37-day flight was over. He was returned to Oklahoma to face trial. Because of the intense publicity the case had received in Creek County, where the Cantrells had lived, the venue for the trial was moved to Canadian County. In 2005, a Canadian county jury convicted Eisenberg of first-degree murder for the death of A.J. Cantrell, for which the jury recommended the death penalty. It convicted him of second-degree murder for the death of Patsy Cantrell, for which he received a sentence of 150 years. Additional counts related to the assaults and the burglary produced additional time. Eisenberg was transferred to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAllister. His appeals ran for the next 17 years. They did not succeed. At a clemency hearing before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board in December of 2022, clemency was denied. His execution date was set for January 12th of 2023. On that morning, Scott James Eisenberg was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was pronounced dead at 10:15 in the morning. In his final statement, he said that he was at peace and that his conscience was clear. His execution was the first of what would become a record-tying series of 11 scheduled executions in Oklahoma that year. Reactions from the family of the Cantrells were, as with many such cases, divided. Their grandson told reporters that he was glad his family's enemy was dead. Their daughter has said, in the years since, that she has chosen to forgive him. As of 2026, the execution of Scott James Eisenberg stands as the endpoint of one of the longest fugitive hunts in Oklahoma history, a case that stretched across 3 states and roughly 500 miles before it was closed. Those are the 10 men whose cases moved through the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.